Welcome everybody to this evening's The Offer. And I'm just going to explain a little bit about Culture Declares Emergency, that we're a growing movement of individuals and organizations involved in art and culture. And we declare that this is a climate and ecological emergency, and we pledge to tell truths, take action, and seek justice. We launched in April 2019, and we were the first sector to form a declarers movement. Based in the UK, but collaborating internationally, we offer community and resources to ensure that sustained action follows a declaration. So why declare? Humanity faces the combined catastrophes of climate change, a mass extinction of vital biodiversity, and a degradation of ecosystems' health. This is the climate and ecological emergency. Why culture? We can think in a new way about culture as organized activities, including visual arts, theatre, literature, live art, film, dance, comedy, public art, environmental arts, design, craft, museum and heritage, learning, education, and many more. Culture Declares Emergency. Our vision is to create a regenerative culture that protects the planet and sustains everyone, everywhere. Our mission is to grow, support, and mobilize a movement of declarers in the UK cultural sector and inspire and work with others internationally. And our values are underpinned by truth-telling, action-taking, and justice-seeking. And you're all very welcome. This evening, you're also very welcome to come and join to declare with Culture Declares Emergency, which is a very sort of easeful process, and you'll be warmly welcomed and introduced. As we aim to be an inclusive movement, we're positively welcoming diversity, particularly people with experience of racism, injustice, and marginalization. So you can find us on culturedeclares.org, follow, share, and talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and hashtag Culture Takes Action. So the offer. So energy for change. And the question is, what do audience want cultural organizations to do around the Earth crisis? And we'll be joined by speakers who will share the latest research and examples of practice as we open up discussion on how we can join up actions for sustainability with work for climate and social justice. So we're joined by Katy Raines, Robin Webster, and Hannah Lee Chalk. And Katy will speak first. Katy will speak for about 15 minutes. And then we thought it would be nice to have like just a 5-minute chat interaction. You can put your questions into chat, or you can use the hand signal as well, and we'll come to you and we can do that. So each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 5-minute Q&A. And then at the end of all of the sessions, we can have a larger Q&A as well. So to introduce Katy, and warm welcome, Katy. She is a founder and CEO of Indigo, www.indigo-limited.com, and it's about audience researchers in the cultural sector, and we'll be talking about their Act Green survey. Katy has developed research and implementation programs for cultural organizations across the UK and Europe. Katy, over to you. Many thanks. Looking forward to hearing this.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for inviting me along. And it's great to get the opportunity to talk about this research. Indigo are audience specialists. We're not environmentalists. We're not experts in any of this stuff. So we have come to it very much with the view of trying to understand what audience members might feel about how cultural organisations are tackling the climate emergency. So we weren't aware of any audience research that had been done. And those of you may have heard of our name in conjunction with COVID, because we did a lot of research on audience sentiment during COVID. And we realised that there were a lot of similarities between the sort of research we were doing during COVID and the research that was needed with audiences around climate change. Because actually, we know nothing about audiences and what they think. So exactly the same as COVID. We were starting from pretty much a blank sheet of paper. We also had a lot of people, as we did with COVID, telling us not to do it and saying, oh, that would be silly. What if audiences say things that we don't want them to say? What if they think that cultural organisations shouldn't be getting involved in this? And our response was, well, we need to know, and we need to know the scale of the problem that we're facing. So I'm going to share the screen and share these slides with you. There's a lot to get through in a relatively short space of time, so I will whiz through them. But the slides will be available afterwards if anybody wants them. So if you miss anything as it goes whizzing past, then we can send a copy of these slides to you. And I'll apologise now for whizzing through them. So we did this piece of work back in May. It was basically 100 organisations signed up to take part, but in the end 58 sent it out. And the way it was done is we provided links to each of the organisations and they sent them out to their databases, so their databases of audiences. So it was England skewed, but we did have responses from across the whole of the UK. And we had nearly 12,000 responses. So it's a really good sample of cultural attenders across the country. They did skew older because generally theatre audiences do. So this more reflects the fact that this is a group of largely theatre attenders than anything else. But there are some interesting examples, and we did have a look at how age affected people's responses. Bias towards female, again, to some extent that reflects the booker base of theatres, but this was more, this was skewed more to females than males. And this is a very culturally engaged sample of people. So these are people who say that they go to some sort of culture at least once a month. So we are definitely talking to the people who go to your cultural organisations. That's who this sample is. It's not the general population. And they had a wide range of interests in art forms. So we asked them which art form they went to the most regularly. And it ranged from performing arts, visual arts, museums, heritage, across the whole lot. So we had, again, we've got a really good wide range of people. So the first thing we wanted to know is how concerned cultural audiences are compared with the general population about the climate emergency. So we blatantly nicked the questions that the Office for National Statistics use about public attitudes to the environment. So what we did is we took the questions that they've already asked the population, so we know what the percentage of the population is that thinks it, and we asked exactly the same questions to the culturally engaged lot. And this is what we saw. So ACT green here means this sample, this bunch of audiences that were asked. So how worried or unworried are you about the impact of climate change? Well, 86% of them are worried or very worried, and they're more worried than the general population. So whether you expect that or not, that was quite interesting. The younger, oh, sorry, what's going on here? Bear with me. Younger audiences were slightly more worried, but the variation was smaller than I expected it to be. So under 35s, you've got 91% compared with 86% in the over 55. So there is some variation there. But as I say, not as much as I expected to see. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at these people on the left who are either neutral about it or they're not worried. That's 14% of respondents. So why aren't they worried about it? Well, the ACT green people, our sample, were more likely to say that there were more urgent things to be worried about. And it wasn't so much that they didn't know much about climate change. So you can see that 35% of the general population say, I'm not worried about it because I don't know very much about it. Whereas the cultural audiences, only 11% of those said that. So those who aren't worried about it, it's not through lack of education, it's because they actually think that there's more urgent things to be worried about. Okay. How much have they changed their lifestyle to help tackle climate change? Again, our cultural audiences have made more change than the general population at large because of the above, because they're more worried about it. And those who haven't made any changes, that's only 6% of our respondents. Why haven't they? And the two biggest reasons by far were, my efforts aren't going to make any difference, and I think large polluters should change before individuals. So they're largely just kind of going, well, I'm just a small person, there's nothing I can do that can make a difference. So we'll come back to that a bit later. Okay, so overall, cultural audiences are much more concerned about this than the general public. So what do they expect cultural organisations to do? So we put this statement in front of them, that cultural organisations have a responsibility to influence society to make radical change to address the climate emergency. And we asked them to what extent they agreed with that statement. And 77% of them did. With the under 35s, it was even higher, 86%. How much importance do you think cultural organisations place on playing an active role in tackling climate change? Well, generally they think, oh, sorry, let me just go back one. Previous, there we go. They do think that as a sector, we do place great importance on it, or some importance on it. But interestingly, when you look at what happened is we asked them about organisations generally, cultural organisations, and then we asked them about the organisation that had sent them the survey. And you see the 15% saying, I don't know, going up to 25%. So overall, they think the sector's doing quite a lot. But when they were asked specifically about that organisation, a bigger proportion of them said, oh, not really sure. So again, we'll come back to that a bit later. Then the third bit, we wanted to know what initiatives they expected cultural organisations to be doing. And for this, what we did was we took the Theatre Green book and the recommendations that are in that for cultural organisations to be following, and we tested to what extent audiences thought those things were important. So I'm sure many of you have come across the Green book before, but it's basically a set of guidelines and toolkits for an organisation to follow in 3 areas: producing work, running sustainable buildings, and operating sustainably. So with producing work, what do they expect most? 90% expect you to be using materials from reused or recycled sources, and that sets and materials are reused. So these were just the top 3 responses. With under 35s, they also, it was much more important to them that funding came from ethical sources. So that was 71%, which was 5% higher than other responses. And they were much more interested in organisations tackling the subject of climate change through the creative output on stage, either that or through running specific programmes. So the younger audience potentially are in the market for content around climate change, much more so than the older audience. Then the buildings, these were the top 2, energy efficiency, which this was back in May, so even more important now, and reducing and recycling waste. But with the under 35s, they were also more interested in biodiversity and only using energy from renewable sources. And then in terms of sustainable operations, they basically expect you to be doing everything. But the top one was obviously single-use plastic, minimising food waste, and things like digital tickets and stuff like that to come quite high up as well. And with the under 35s, they were significantly more interested or expected you to be having increased availability of plant-based options, 54% of them, website sustainability, and sharing sustainability policy with audiences, which again, I'll come back to in a sec. And then the final section we looked at was, okay, so that's what you think about climate change. That's what you expect the cultural sector to be doing. That's what you expect your organisations to be doing. What part are you willing to play as audiences? So how likely would you be to make use of or get involved in any of the following initiatives if they were offered? So the percentage is how likely they would be. So being open to suggestions of more sustainable food choices at the venue, 72%. And then there's quite a few here around travel options and stuff. So the under 35s were basically just much more likely to do all of them. And interestingly, we did a split on the travel thing for urban and rural audiences. So obviously, if you live in an urban area, you're going to have more access to public transport. So they were much more interested in a reduced ticket price in order to use public transport. Car sharing was more interesting to the people in the rural areas, and carbon offsetting for the journey was very similar. So there are definitely some things around travel here, and we know that travel is one of the biggest culprits in terms of the carbon footprint of an organisation. So this is quite interesting that audiences are kind of willing to do something around this. Okay. Fundraising, what would you be likely to give money to if cultural organisations asked you? And interestingly, biodiversity, schemes around biodiversity came top out of all of them. Artistic projects exploring climate change for the main programme, although it's low here in terms of 31% of your audience is being willing to support that financially, still quite significant. And what we did was we looked at it through previous donors as well. So this, this is under 35. So under 35s, not known for their philanthropy to arts organisations generally, but much more likely to give money for these things than older audiences. So that's really interesting. And then looking at supporters and donors. Now, I have to say, I had a bit of a theory about supporters and donors, because typically in the arts organisations that I've worked with in the past, the people who give money to arts organisations tend to be older, whiter, more middle class, well off, probably retired. And I thought, they're going to be the ones that aren't as up for all this climate change stuff as the others. They're going to be the climate deniers. They're going to be the ones going and potentially with the loudest voices on boards and influencing chief executives, saying, I don't know why we're bothering with all this stuff. So I was really interested to see whether this would play out. So 62% of our sample had at some point made a donation to a cultural organisation, and 42% were regular supporters. So there's quite a lot of them in this sample. And funnily enough, the more engaged they were, the more they have donated to cultural organisations. Those who've donated are even more worried about climate change than those who haven't. So I was completely wrong, which is always good as a researcher to be completely wrong sometimes. And then in terms of the agreement with our statement, 79% compared with 67%. So the more engaged and supportive they are of culture, the more worried they are about the climate emergency as well. And they were, funnily enough, they were more likely to say they would donate to some of these initiatives. So my kind of takeaways from this, in terms of what we do with all this information, firstly, I think the key takeaway for me is audiences do want you to do this. They're more concerned than the general public, and they've made more changes than the general population. 90% of them agree that you have a responsibility to make change. Those who are less concerned, it's because they think that what they do won't make any difference, or that it might mean compromising on quality. Some of the comments we saw were around, food or drink or whatever. They're coming to the theatre for a great night out, and they're worried that by choosing more sustainable choices, they're compromising on quality. So these are key messaging points for marketeers and communications staff of cultural organisations. The second is the communications challenge. Audiences don't know where you stand. 25% of those questioned about the individual organisation's commitment to climate change said they didn't know where they stood. We went through the 100 organisations that signed up to take part in Act Green and had a look on the homepage. 95 of them did not mention anything about the environment or climate change on their homepages. Only 5 organisations had anything on their homepage at all. So, and yet if we remember, one of the key messaging points for younger people was that they wanted you to talk about what you're doing in terms of sustainability. And I think the biggest challenge for, I come from a marketing background, so the biggest challenge I think for people like me in theatres and stuff is there's so many things to talk about. You're probably doing so much. How on earth do you message that to your customers? Where do you start? I think the first thing you need to work out what you're going to talk about. So here we compare what audiences expect you to be doing with what they think is the most important. So even if you were just going to pick out a few messages to put in a newsletter or something, these top 3 would be a good place to start because they think they're really important to them and they think you should be doing them. So that's a clue. And for the organisations that took part, they can see their own results to this in this graph. Secondly, our suggestion was to pick some sort of hero project that you can be known for, not to dismiss all the other work that you're doing, but so that people can go, oh yeah, that's the venue that's doing such and such. So things like Home in Manchester with the beehives on the roof, or Chichester Festival Theatre doing their carbon offsetting for people travelling to the venue, sort of having something that you could be known for. Where are you going to talk about it? So again, for example, here, avoiding disposable packaging and single-use plastic, for me, the most logical place to talk about that is when people are buying a cup of coffee, not on the website and not on the tickets. The digital tickets thing, when they get their ticket confirmation, reminding them that, thanking them for using digital tickets via the email and not printing them out, that kind of stuff. The old stickers on the hand dryers for, telling people how much carbon you're saving by using hand dryers and not paper towels, etc. So I think it's also about when customers are most receptive to receiving that message, and when there's a benefit in receiving that message, rather than it all being shoved down their throats or put in a policy on the bottom of the website. And then how are you going to talk about it? So when do you just need a quick reminder, kind of stickers on the hand dryers? And when do you want a detailed explanation of something like maybe the set stuff that they're not going to see front of house, but you need to tell them about? Maybe that's an article in a newsletter or a video with somebody about it. So what level of detail do you need to go into? And then the language around it. And I think this is a real challenge. And I think for some of the things that they said, they didn't think what they were going to do was going to make any difference. If we can quantify some of that, if every audience member did X, this is the collective difference it would make. I think that might help with some of that. And then using positive language rather than kind of sackcloth and ashes approach, which I think a lot of the audiences in the comments thought they were going to be doing if they had to do environmental stuff. So for example, here, when we asked people in this way, which is most important to you, only 3% said increasing the availability of plant-based options was important. But when it was presented like this, being open to suggestions of more sustainable food choices at the venue, which, let's face it, is probably plant-based options in most cases, 72%. So it just shows you the difference in the way that the language is used. And that's just one example, but I'm sure there's loads. So that's me on my whistle-stop tour of the research. I'm going to end the slideshow.
That's great.
There we go.
I love the whistle top. The whistle was really, really good. I just wanted to ask you, I mean, if anybody has any questions, could you sort of put, either use the hand sign or maybe put something into chat. But what was your time frame for this, Katy? When did the forms go out?
It was from the 9th to the 29th of May.
Okay.
Last year. And we're going to be repeating it again next year at similar time.
Okay. And can you just tell us again exactly what sort of venues they were going to?
So there was a mixture. It was mostly theatres, art centres, concert halls. It was mostly venue-based organisations who sent it out. Okay.
That's really, really helpful. And so this gets, sorry, I mean, if anybody else has got a question, but so this gets, your findings now, your summation, your analysis is now distributed out. And what feedback do you get from the various organisations? What's the ongoing conversation you have?
Well, it's been quite interesting because we didn't really know what to expect when we did it. And we had a couple of webinars early on to share the results. And since then, it's been a bit of a snowball effect that a lot of people have then heard about the research. It's on our website. We've had loads of people download the results. And I've been asked to go and talk at lots of things like this, lots of bigger conferences and stuff, just to sort of get the conversation going, because we're very aware that this is just only scratching the surface, and the idea is it's supposed to be a sort of baseline to start us off, and that it probably asks as many questions as it answers. So we're really keen to hear from organisations who've got more questions that they want to find out. But one of the key benefits of doing it this way is every organisation can see their own results from their own audiences, but collectively we can get a picture of the whole sector. So that's why it's really important that lots of people take part in the same survey questions. Everyone could go off and do their own thing, but we wouldn't then get this body of evidence that we're then able to sort of cut into by age or type of organisation and all that kind of stuff.
It's great. And it's really good that you're going to make available all of these findings as well, actually, Katy.
Yeah.
Of course. We like that. Okay. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions, or shall we press forward? I mean, if there's any other questions, we'll have another opportunity later down the line as well to have a conversation. Okay. Robin Webster, I'm really happy to introduce you and say hello. I'll just very briefly say that Robin leads the Advocacy Communications Programme for Climate Outreach, focusing on providing civil society campaigners with knowledge, tools and research to help them engage all sorts of people on climate change. She's been knocking around the environmental world for 20 years as a researcher, journalist and campaigner. She helped to start up Carbon Brief, Climate Science and Energy blog, and has been a researcher for the European Climate Foundation. She's also the author of Climate Outreach's #Talking Climate Handbook, amongst many others. Thank you so much. Welcome, Robin. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks so much. And I think I'm going to start with the share screen thing. So cue a bit of lift music for a moment. Oh, I think we're getting there. Yeah. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's all good.
This is all good for, yes, great. Sometimes the sound goes a little bit. Right, yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to do about 15 minutes-ish on a piece of research that we've done at Climate Outreach over the last couple of years. It's quite a substantial piece of work, as you can see from my slide, exploring communicating climate justice with young adults in Europe. Why am I doing it in this context? So I'm going to bring in a certain amount of kind of thinking from the cultural perspective, but really to some extent, I'm kind of hoping to present our research to you and kind of prompt some thinking. So there's definitely some crossover with some of what Katy has been presenting, but also like a little bit less explicitly tied to the cultural sector. But the logic behind the work is, as many of you will know, the call for climate justice is a powerful part of the climate movement at the moment, and particularly sort of amongst the younger generations. But however, not that many people have kind of tested actually how the language of climate justice lands with populations, and particularly how it lands with our younger people. So this research was done as a part of a coalition called Spark, which is a European Commission funded consortium of civil society organisations across 13 European countries. So in doing this work, we were very much drawing and working very closely with our partners, and it's a European Commission funded piece of work. And as I said in the introduction, I work for an organisation called Climate Outreach, and our mandate is building and sustaining cross-societal support for climate action, overcoming political polarisation and turning concern into action. What does that mean? What that means is often we see ourselves as kind of sitting between the researchers who are exploring the best ways to talk and communicate and engage people on climate change, and the people who are out there in the world actually doing the job, and trying to find ways of making links and provide information that is helpful, usable, operationable by those who are out there in the world doing it. And of course, you as representatives of the cultural sector are a really, really important part of that task. So this project very much fits into that world. So what is the actual what we did with this project? So we did 2 different pieces of work, and the first part of the work was a fairly major survey across 6,000 participants across 6 different European countries. And this was actually, it was exploring the European Commission's definition of young people, which is actually really what we end up calling young adults aged 18 to 35. So that survey explored the responses and reactions of young adults across these 6 European countries aged 18 to 35 to messaging, to stories, to narratives about the climate justice analysis. And then once we had the results from that piece of work, we then undertook a series of focus groups, values-based focus groups, with young adults who are more concerned about, have expressed concern about climate change, but are not actually active in taking action on climate change. And this, again, is one of the reasons, thinking about the kind of stories that we tell about climate justice through efforts like cultural engagement. And you get people who say, I'm really worried about climate change, I really want to do something, but actually they're not actually doing something when you ask them about it. So these focus groups kind of intended to dig a little bit deeper into those young adults' responses and ideas about talking about climate justice. So to give a kind of summary of the results, what we found is that young people across Europe, young adults across Europe, are unfamiliar with the terminology of climate justice. If we ask them sort of like, do you know what climate justice means? Only about 32% of them said that they could explain what it meant to someone else. So the sort of, and this is something that we often find in talking about climate change, is the actual kind of language, the technical language that's used is off-putting to people. People don't always can't always get their heads around what it means. But crossing over with what Katy said, what we found is that particularly the young adults who told us they were worried about climate change, when they talked about it in their focus groups, what was really noticeable was how deeply worried they were about climate change. They talked about, they used words, sort of apocalyptic kind of language in talking about climate change. You could see the depth of that concern in this generation. Then when we talked, and I'll talk a bit more about sort of what this analysis is, but when we talked about the climate justice analysis with these young adults, what we found is that many of them supported many of the principles. So the principles of climate justice that is talking about giving the increased impacts of climate change on more marginalized people, understanding that impact is disproportionate for some communities and more than other communities. The understanding that there's a historical legacy there in the impact of industrialized countries and other parts of the world, and the support for paying reparations. The idea that we need a more kind of systemic and transformative way of looking at climate change. Like, a lot of these ideas were there in the young people, and they supported many of those principles. However, when you kind of dug a little bit deeper and started talking to them, you found that they lacked a kind of deeper understanding of the kind of analysis they talked to. It was sort of relatively superficial. And finally, we found that they felt powerless and didn't really trust governments or corporations, and they disliked the idea of the sort of this divisive language. So what we found in this, in other words, is young people, you need specific examples of how change happens in order to sort of engage with climate justice analysis. So just kind of digging into this a little bit more in depth, each of the different bits I just talked about. So young adults, we found in this survey, are really concerned about climate change, and they're willing to take action. So in this survey across young adults across Europe, who had like no particular political persuasion, only 4% of them said they didn't want to take action. 25% were willing to take part in a legal protest, and like sort of slightly to our shock, to be honest, 1 in 10 said they were prepared to break the law to tackle climate change. So you can really see that sort of depth of that concern there. And I said in the focus groups with specifically concerned young people, they really were deeply concerned. They used words like catastrophe, apocalypse, the end. So you can see this concern about climate change is how sort of serious it is, and understandably so, in this generation. Then we sort of start to dig into the details of the climate justice analysis. As I said, I've got that figure slightly wrong, less than 30% said they thought they could explain the term climate justice to someone else. But when you actually start to think about the principles of the climate justice analysis, we saw really high results. So 81% said they agree we need to transform society and change how our economy works to tackle climate change. Therefore, in other words, there was a real kind of understanding that we need big change in response to climate change, which is a core part of the climate justice analysis, that we need big transformative systemic change. And quite a similarly high number, 72%, agreeing that those most affected by climate change should have more say in decisions about the climate solutions. So again, this part of the climate justice analysis, though the young adults didn't really have a lot of sort of academic background in it or know the terminology, when you actually talked to them about the principles, they were really, there was a lot of kind of support and agreement. But again, it wasn't really that deep, it wasn't really a deep understanding of how climate justice affects different communities. So for example, we saw that in the survey, only 20% agreed that globally women are more impacted by climate change than men. And there is actually considerable evidence to back up that statistic. So the fact that only 20% shows that there's a kind of relatively shallow understanding of some of these principles. And climate justice is all about drawing the links between social justice and climate change. And what we saw is that the young adults in this work said they cared about climate change and social justice, were issues like gender equality, racial justice and poverty, but they rarely connected those to climate change. There's sort of a slightly superficial sort of understanding of the link between poverty and being impacted by climate change, but not a kind of deeper understanding of that. And another core part of the climate justice analysis, we saw that they didn't have a strong grasp of the idea of historical responsibility, the idea that communities from one part of the world and the impact of colonialism hold more responsibility for the history of climate change than in the other parts of the world. Again, this is a core part of the climate justice analysis, which isn't really reflected in young people's understandings. Then another thing that we found, which is often backed up by other evidence from other previous surveys, is the young adults in this work expressed a strong sense of powerlessness, so that they could see these big changes that were needed, but they conveyed the strong sense of their own powerlessness within those systems. And they felt that power lies with government and companies, and also that responsibility to do something lies with governments and companies, but they lacked the trust that these powerful actors will actually take action. And I think this kind of sense of them feeling the need to understand that actually action will be taken is a really important part of kind of what needs to happen to increase that power. And I think this quote kind of really reflects what we saw the young adults say. I believe that big changes are needed, but they're not going to be achieved however they should be. That kind of really encapsulated some of what we encountered in this work. And then interestingly, what we found is that because the young adults, they were saying, I can see that really big change needs to happen. I can see that big systemic change needs to happen. But and I don't really think that individual behavior is the whole answer. But they kind of tended to default to talking about individual behavior when asked what they thought should happen, because they couldn't really see things in that bigger context. And I think, and some express kind of resistance to the idea that younger people should solve the problem of climate change, shouldn't have any of that responsibility. So you can see some of the kind of contradictions playing out in how young adults respond to this work. And then we also saw that young adults kind of really disliked the language of kind of division, and which is a kind of the idea of kind of pointing fingers. So in the climate justice analysis, the idea of kind of accountability is really important, understanding that some actors are more responsible for climate change than others. But in this work that we did, we found that young adults didn't like the sound of taking away decision-making power and resources from anyone. They didn't like the idea of finger pointing. This often kind of prompted quite negative reactions, and they responded more positively to language around sort of balance and redistribution. And you can see the sort of orange on this slide reflects the kind of language that was somewhat rejected by the people in the research that we did. And you can see here, and in this quote in a workshop participants, that like a kind of dislike of that idea, dislike of finger pointing, an us versus them story. You're making two camps, you're dividing the population into two. We could see that in the workshops, often young people really kind of dislike this approach, and though it may be absolutely justifiable in terms of the kind of the arguments that are made around climate justice, this is kind of what we saw when we tested it with this particular audience. So kind of what does this start to mean? What might it mean for cultural institutions that are talking about climate change? So we can see that some kind of language and ideas that seem to be quite effective with this audience is the idea of kind of restoring balance, the idea of being specific about who is doing what, the idea of solidarity, the idea of kind of ethical language around the polluter paying, and critiques of kind of economic growth and capitalism. These are all kind of quite powerful ideas for this audience. What worked less well was ideas around climate justice as a terminology, so like using this kind of very techie language without kind of saying what it means. The idea of division, as I said, finger pointing kind of to the wealthy and powerful as causing climate change. This resonated less well with this audience. So I was wondering, like, for a cultural institution, it sort of indicates to me that sort of language around balance, solidarity, polluter pays, ethical language around the need for us all to act together on climate change might be more likely to be more powerful with young adults. So what does some of this mean in terms of kind of how we talk about climate change? So I've just popped in here kind of some of the recommendations that we have as a result of this research, and kind of I highlighted in red some of the thoughts that I felt might be kind of a particular interest for cultural institutions. I mean, you are the experts, but I feel like cultural institutions have that kind of unique opportunity to kind of draw links in people's minds and kind of show complexities and networks. And that's really what the climate justice analysis is about. For example, here, one less effective approach to talking about climate change that we suggest is saying climate change is an isolated technical challenge. It's all about reducing emissions by X% and Y%. And actually, understanding that climate change and social justice are inseparable issues is a really important issue to help people see climate change in this more systemic, society-wide way. And I feel like this is something that cultural institutions have that greater impact to help people make the links. And ditto kind of, instead of understanding that climate change sits in a historical context and a sort of international historical context, and seeing those kind of wider systems. And I think also empowering young people, saying that young people can play an important role but not saying that young people carry the burden of responsibility on their shoulders, which was something that many young people rejected. And finally, I just wanted to give one quote, which I think kind of really encapsulates, I suppose, something sort of profound that I felt like we learned from this, that was also reflected in a great article by a professor called Julia Steinberger, who writes about climate change, climate justice quite a lot. And she was talking about an experience that she had trying to communicate climate change and communicate climate justice with a younger audience. And what she realized in that experience is, young adults of this era don't need to hear more about emissions trajectories. They need to hear about trajectories of popular struggle, when and how people without power change the world. So that idea of kind of stories of power and change, about how people, younger adults, can be engaged in ways of changing the world, and that it's possible to do that, I think is something that came out really strongly from this work as well. And that's the end of that presentation. I think that was about 15 minutes, I hope so.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Are there any questions that are coming up from anybody? I think it's really interesting, Robin. In fact, I've been writing a proposal today which mentions climate justice, and you suddenly, a term or phrase enters into your consciousness or into discussion, and then you start to use it. But as you say, for many people, and for me in the past, I've gone, well, what's that then? And you have to really understand. It's actually, the way that language is adopted and used. It's quite a slow process in many cases, but I found that really, really interesting and informative, actually. And we also talk in Culture Declares Emergency about what are the inspiring stories of change which goes
Yeah.
back to that wonderful, last quote that you dealt with, that we don't need more data necessarily in one sense, or emissions, but we do need to know how people have risen to the struggle and actually transcended or transformed. So I think that's really excellent to hear. Good. So
I noticed that Safi Jones has got a hand up.
you can unmute.
Hi there, thank you so much for this. My name's Safi, I work at Qubit Artists, a small arts organisation in London. We just had a session actually yesterday with a group of our young people talking about the climate emergency. And I'm just finding it so interesting, this talking about language, and that you're bringing up the use of language and how important it is, because the conversation we had today as a team reflecting on the session was a concern really about the language that was coming up through the creative session with the young people. There was a lot of like guilt, the words of like guilt kept coming up, and we were wondering, how much of the language that young people are using is learned from adults, is heard from the people around them, and the way that we use language in all areas of society around climate change. And I guess I would just be interested to hear whether there are your thoughts on the use of language that from young people.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and sort of quite moving to hear about it. Yeah, I think yes, in a way. One of the things I reflected on in doing this work is that when we sort of heard not about the language but about the knowledge base of young adults in this work, I was thinking they are making fairly simplistic connections in X or Y way, and you think, well, of course, because that's what people have been exposed to, and they're reflecting the conversation of the debate around them, the conversation that they see in the media, perhaps what they've been taught at school, there are limited, what we hear our peers talking about, these are the things that influence how the stories that we tell ourselves. And at Climate Outreach, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we tell, how our lives we run, and the framing of our minds, really told about stories that resonate with our values and kind of sit with our framing of the world. And so, of course, young people will do exactly the same thing. I think it is really sort of concerning in a way that language is in our culture can feel, I think, so disempowering for this generation. As you say, actually there is evidence out there to show that as people we can cope with quite negative, scary information, and I think XR actually gave everybody a very interesting example of that when it kicked off, when it was in 2019. It had big, scary language and messaging, and actually it was very impactful. But because it was tied to a sense that there's something you can do, and there's a concept in climate comms called efficacy, which is the belief that I can do something, and if I do something, it will make a difference. And obviously, this is the idea of efficacy is sort of a greater struggle for younger people, because they do have less efficacy in the world. They have less ability to make a difference. And I think as much as we can in these kind of conversations that you're talking about, finding a way of giving younger people an open space to talk about, the stories that they're being told. But then also I see it as sort of providing an infrastructure or kind of a leg up that will allow them to open up to new stories and empowering stories that will help them to think about action in their own lives and what they can do and being part of a wider community. And it's only by offering almost that sort of infrastructure of language and examples and knowledge that can you then kind of go on to the next stage. And the kind of thing that I think disturbs me sometimes about kind of the way our culture talks about climate change is it doesn't give people that. It doesn't give that sense of here's a thing to be a part of. This is how you step into action. And that, I think, is how people cope with the incredibly negative ideas around climate change, by knowing how to step in and take action. So yeah, sorry, I could talk more about it, but it's all really interesting stuff.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Robin. There will be a chance for more questions, as I said, after Hannah Lee Chook has warm welcome, Hannah. And just to say that Hannah is Learning Manager at Manchester Museum, and we'll be talking about the Carbon Ruins Manchester project at Manchester Museum. She describes herself on Twitter as museum researcher, curator, educator, thinker with an interest in geology, learning, material culture, and STS, amongst other things. So I'm going to have to ask what STS is.
Oh, see, I haven't used my Twitter account for so long, so this is interesting. Yeah, sort of science and technology studies. So kind of looking at how science has often been sort of portrayed as this sort of technical thing, whereas it's very human. Basically, it's a human endeavor. And actually, yeah, that's a really important part of what we do, I think, is bring things to ground them a bit more, so make things a bit more human. And yeah. So can I just say, Robin's presentation is really brilliantly kind of raising some of the exact same aspects of working around the climate emergency and climate justice and social justice that's actually underpinning what I am going to talk about. So I'm just going to try and do a little bit of a share screen. So I'm assuming you can see my presentation.
Yeah, we can see it, Hannah.
Brilliant, fabulous, right. Well, I shall begin. So first of all, thank you ever so much for inviting me. As you said, I am the Learning Manager at Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester. I'm just going to frame what that means, working at Manchester Museum, because actually for quite some time now, the museum's actually been shut. We are still shut as we continue to undergo a massive transformation called Hello Future. And the idea of this transformation is to change the museum physically as well as the organisational level change. So when we reopen, which is soon coming up on the 18th of February, our visitors will definitely find new galleries, new spaces and more accessible facilities. What hasn't changed is our mission, which is to build understanding between cultures and a more sustainable world. And to do this, we use our collection of over 4.5 million objects that span many disciplines from archaeology through to zoology. But as I mentioned, the museum's transformation has also been about the organisation itself. And that side is focused on how we achieve our mission, which is all about our values of care, inclusion and imagination. And these really are underpinning what we do and have been sort of fundamental to the work we've been sort of doing over the closure period and as we move towards reopening. So the project I want to talk to you about is about all of those values, but literally only just launched at the end of November, although it's been something I've been thinking about and working on for a few years now. What we do know as the basis of this, and what Robin's just beautifully set up, is that we know that young people care about climate change, and we also understand it's often not very easy for them because they feel burdened by the weight of responsibility that's placed on their generation. But the scale and urgency of the climate crisis can also leave them feeling sort of hopeless, anxious, and often quite angry as well, which is totally understandable. But what we also know is that young people do actually care a lot, and they're really interested naturally because it's their future that's on the line. And we also know that they very much have the creativity and imagination that's really going to be needed to think positively about the future. So this is exactly what Carbon Ruins Manchester aims to support. So it's the museum's response to the urgent need for social change. It's our belief in the power of creativity and imagination, but also our commitment to supporting learners to develop the skills they're going to need for the future. But it's also a slight acknowledgement that teachers often struggle to find the time or justification to do this in school. So Carbon Ruins is actually a concept that was developed at Lund University in Sweden, which uses the idea of a museum as a place for telling stories about objects. And it asks you to imagine what would be displayed in a museum in 2050 once we've achieved net zero. So underlying that concept is that the idea that by looking back from a positive future of 2050, it's more sort of easy to be critical about our lives today and kind of identify the sort of changes that need to happen from now to the future. It allows us to kind of compare these two worlds and identify the behaviours and habits and activities and products and organisations and processes and all these sorts of things that are going to need to change if we're going to reach this really positive future point. So I want to show you a short film just to give you a better sense of what happened in Lund. Now, if you don't get any sound, can you just wave at me and I will click something possibly, but hopefully you will hear this.
Not hearing a sound at the moment.
Give me a moment.
Sure.
Sorry, hang on. Hang on. Sorry.
Don't worry.
Technical problem.
No, I don't know. Don't worry. Always
Right. Share screen.
no rush.
Share sound. That's it.
Well done.
Okay. Can you hear that?
Welcome to our brand new museum, Fossil, and our first exhibition, Carbon Ruins. So in the fossil age, we would extract fossil fuels and then turn them into small plastics bits called Lego that we played with. Now, of course, we don't do that anymore. Lego invested heavily in bioplastic, so making this from bio-based materials instead, and kids can still happily play with Legos. So this might look like normal grass, but it's actually made from oil. In the fossil age, we would use artificial grass on our football fields because we didn't want to mow them. So we're very happy to have this preserved right here in the exhibition. Here we see the fast food hamburger. As critique of industrialized meat became more common, they tried to replace the protein between the buns. First they went to plant-based alternatives, and then they went to lab-grown meat, but eventually there was no sustaining the fast food hamburger. Here we have something quite exotic, frequent flyer cards. And these were used to incentivize aviation. So the more you flew, the more perks you got. You got to board a plane first, you got to sit in the lounge, and these eventually disappeared. So we're very happy to have two preserved right here in the exhibition. Thank you for your time. There's plenty of more to explore in this exhibition, so please come see for yourself.
Okay, so Carbon Ruins Manchester is going to build on this fabulous idea that Lund University developed, but there's a few differences, because the original Carbon Ruins project brought together academics, researchers, business people and policymakers, and what they did was create a museum exhibition in a university. So we will be doing things differently because, firstly, as I mentioned, this is very much about young people. So Carbon Ruins Manchester is explicitly for schools. It's for key stages 2, 3 and 4. And secondly, Carbon Ruins Manchester is actually going to happen in a museum. So we're asking schools to select an object from the present that represents the change that needs to happen to reach net zero in 2050. Now, while Lund have produced some educational materials around the Carbon Ruins work, they've just focused on kind of a lesson plan for secondary students, but we're going to be taking things a bit further in Manchester, because we've developed our own approach that reflects the UK setting in the curriculum. And we've broken the process into 4 steps that teachers can follow. We'll also be sharing key stage specific resources to help teachers to engage with this on their own terms, whether that's for a couple of hours in an afternoon or over a series of lessons. And just to illustrate the way we're doing this, in the imagine step, we're very aware that imagining 2050 could be quite difficult, or it might come very easily. It came difficult to me, but to help the groups think about different aspects of daily life in the future and the differences compared to today, and using this as a starting point for the pupils and students to think about what has changed or stopped or disappeared, whether that's because it was unsustainable, it might have been something harmful, it might be something that's been banned or phased out, it may no longer be needed, it may no longer be possible, it may be something from today that's become obsolete in 2050, something's been replaced by something better, or even something that's gone extinct by 2050. We're also in sort of trying to encourage people to think about the curation process, which is the point at which the object selected that represents the change that happened to reach zero carbon. And it might be the object that being what's actually changed, or it might represent or symbolize the change. But this is where the story about how that happened comes in. And this is the really important thing. It's not so much about the object, it's about the story that's told. So we'll be asking the students to think about when the change happened, whether someone or a particular company or a trend drove that change, whether it happened somewhere specific, or did it happen all at once? Was there resistance? Were there setbacks or obstacles, and how they were overcome? So this is where the group gets to imagine and speculate about a process over time. So we've put together a new site for teachers to use to help them to work through the process of selecting an object and writing their label. Because what we want to do is to create a virtual carbon ruins exhibition, displaying all the objects and stories online to sort of showcase this work. But for Manchester schools in particular, we're actually going to create the exhibition for real, a real carbon ruins exhibition in the museum. So we're asking all the Manchester schools to submit their objects, and we have brought together a group of 8 really fabulous climate savvy young people who are going to be part of a judging panel and who will join a number of museum staff to select the 12 winning entries. And first of all, those winning entries will have their displays containing the object installed in school in the summer term before we bring all of those 12 objects together to be displayed in the museum in an exhibition. So on the site, we've given teachers some example objects selected by the learning team to show how narratives can be used to tell the story of an object and how it represents the change that's actually happened. So one example is a broken iPhone. And what we're not saying is that there'll be no phones in 2050. But what we do want to say is that phones that you can't mend and phones you can't update and phones that have built-in obsolescence will no longer exist in 2050. And you can see we've imagined how we might get from today, where phones are regularly replaced, to 2050, when all phones can be mended and when a phone is a once in a lifetime purchase. And we've selected some sort of drivers to that may have made that change happen and that may prompt that transformation that's needed. So there's a lot of speculation, but there are there's thinking behind it. Another example is a piece of coal that it turns out I need to probably update after the news today. But again, you can see how the label tells the story of change, not always being simple or smooth, but having to overcome obstacles. But we tell this as a speculative story that's also hopeful about a process. It has its ups and downs, but we get there in the end. Other examples to really illustrate the kind of this being more than just a technical kind of problem is that things like a life jacket that we have in the museum that was collected from Lesbos in 2016. So this could be displayed to represent the migrant crisis and all of the deaths that happen as people flee their homes. And for this object, we can imagine how it would probably take a massive disaster to force the government to change its policy, to start understanding the importance of welcoming climate migrants that are going to increasingly be kind of seeking sort of sanctuary on our shores. Or perhaps the acceptance of climate migrants might be a way of the UK paying its substantial loss and damage bill. Who knows? But it's about coming up with this idea of a process of change. Finally, and I apologise because I like to have a little bit of a dig at the government here, but we could just as easily put the national curriculum in display, representing the education system's failure to support learners to gain the relevant skills and understanding they need for the future, and to tell a story of how schools may have eventually become places where creativity and relevant skills are developed, maybe even where teachers are handed back some power to be able to offer personalised, place-based and cross-curricular learning. Who knows? We can just imagine. But there's kind of, you might be wondering, why would teachers bother and what's the point? Because actually they obviously have a lot on their plates. They're still catching up after COVID and there's all sorts of pressures on their time. But for me, these two quotes really illustrate the value of this. And they come from a conversation that I had with Ludwig, who you saw in the film. They really capture the magic of carbon ruins. And at Manchester Museum, we genuinely believe that Carbon Ruins is a great opportunity for us to do what we do best at the museum, which is making stories and bringing ideas to life with objects, and to use this to help pupils and students and also teachers to address climate change in a positive and hopeful and creative and imaginative way. And the important thing is that by speculating on how we can get to this positive future, and by looking back from that positive point rather than looking forward from today, Carbon Ruins isn't about the future, it's about possible futures. And as a result, it really hopefully will reinforce the fact that there are still many possible futures and that there's still time and space for people to shape the future they want. I think this is the really important thing, and something that we are very keen to kind of work with teachers as we understand how this works in practice, is to look at how young people can avoid what Robin was saying about the kind of default to smaller actions and feeling the burden of responsibility, how that sort of scale of change and the transformation that's needed can actually be activated rather than feeling overwhelmed. So it's important to stress that this is a pilot year. We're continuing to test out the process and work with schools and teachers to adjust and refine the resources and content, and we'll continue to add things to the site. We know that it will work better next year when we can give schools more time to plan this into their teaching schedules, but we're still really confident that we'll be getting some amazing, thought-provoking and no doubt slightly off-the-wall proposal. So here's the link to the new site and also my email address if you want to get in touch. There's also some really interesting research that's been carried out in Lund that unpicks their process of speculative thinking and how that worked in their specific context. And I want to just reinforce, we're so grateful for the team in Lund who've been so generous in supporting us to use their concepts and experiences. And we will be working together with them to compare and reflect on what happened in Manchester and to look at the outcomes in the future. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
No, it's wonderful. Really, really wonderful, Hannah. I find that very stimulating. And I'd like to invite everybody who's here to put into chat what object
would yes.
Carbon.
I know it's very addictive. There are so many.
It's really got me going. I mean, even I've got a fair phone.
Fabulous.
I can mend it myself, but you know, I'm a bit scared of doing that. But I'm just, you know, I'm thinking I've got to go for it. Yeah, wonderful. Are there any questions directly that anybody would like to talk through with Hannah?
Oh, we're getting some good suggestions anyway.
Let's have a look.
And I think the joy of this is that it, as I said, the object is kind of the hook, but what the meaty bit is that story. It's what it says. I mean, I want to put Greta Thunberg in a display case because by 2050 her work will be done and there will be no school protests and climate strikes because it will have been achieved. So not that I can make Greta Thunberg get in a display case, but you know.
You could work with Madame Tussauds.
Yes.
Only if they're using, I mean, how sustainable Madame Tussauds though?
Very good question.
Using. Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you, Sarah Jane, who's just leaving, but thanks for your thanks as well. She's really enjoyed the session. So Hannah, how long have you been working on this, all told?
Well, so I came across the Lund University work. My God, it was before COVID because I was in Oslo at a conference, and we reconnected with the team just at the beginning of the pandemic because it was my first Zoom call. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking, and then as the world reopened up and more recently as the museum sort of become less of a bomb site, we've been sort of connecting with teachers and local council, education people, and trying to refine the concept a bit more and get a better sense of how it works. So the big push has mainly been since the summer to sort of pull everything together, but it is definitely ongoing. And I think that we will, so my main concern was originally about how we don't end up with everyone going plastic straws, for example, which kind of doesn't necessarily, without one hell of a good story, capture what we're trying to get at, and actually how we can support teachers to prod children and encourage them to kind of take that thinking a bit further. But the extent to which that's going to be about us supporting teachers rather than us supporting the delivery of content almost. So this is, as I said, a pilot year, and we do have some really great contacts with teachers who will be finding out how they go about it. But in terms of the relevance of this piece of work, it's so brilliant in that it could be done as an English language or writing exercise. It could be done as a design piece of work about products and things. It could be done about history, looking at how change happens in the past and thinking forward. It just feels so relevant and exciting. And for it to be all about what museums do and the museum process just reminds me why I love working in museums.
And also in the, you know, Manchester being at the heart of the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely.
It seems to be completely fitting one way or another. I'm just going to invite Katy and Robin to switch on their cameras again, please, just so that we can all sort of just have a little bit more of a shared conversation. And Bridget as well, because Bridget's been really well, she's been the key connector here, haven't you, Bridget, in bringing everybody together. And do you want to just talk a little bit about, about what you're up to, Bridget, as well, and how this all connects in with what Katy and Robin and Hannah are doing?
There's quite a lot to mention, but what particularly interested me really was this question about efficacy and agency in young adults. So, it was interesting that Katy's research, showed this this need, this willingness and desire to see cultural organizations, live up to this responsibility to address the crisis in content. And so, yeah, I'm really pushing and wanting to see and running, training and projects to encourage museums to enable this positopian way of working with young people, with all educational audiences, well, all public audiences, to imagine possible futures, to face the reality, to know what's going wrong, and to really understand the injustices and the externalities of our extractive economic system. So yeah, there's too much to mention in a short time scale, but yeah, it's all very exciting work. Thank you.
Robin and Katy and Hannah, are you aware of each other's work, or is this kind of forged a nice connection point as well between you?
Forged a nice connection point.
Yeah, ditto.
Me too.
I think it would just be really good to see, how things evolve and shape up over the coming year as well. Are there any other questions? Where are we at with everything? So we're sort of a little bit short of 7 o'clock. What are your hopes? Okay, Hannah, you've got the exhibition opening in February. Well, the museum is opening in February, yeah? And Carbon Ruins as a pilot project will be there. Where exactly in the museum is that going to be?
Still to be decided. There's options. There are various options. We're still waiting to see what happens when people come back in the building, to be honest. Yeah, okay. There's a number of spaces. So yes, it will be somewhere visible and very unavoidable, definitely.
And how many objects have been determined so far, Anna, in the count?
We haven't opened up because we're still in this throes of just getting to reopening. We won't be opening the submission platform until our website's finished, which is happening very soon. Yeah. It's all very, yeah. But we have spoken with I think there's about 20 schools signed up. So whether they do that one per class, hopefully, rather than one per pupil, we're trying to encourage a democratic process of selecting and agreeing on an object, so it's not just individuals.
I think that's great. So there'll be a conversation between the students, between the young people, and they can perhaps put it to a vote as well. You know, that sounds
Absolutely, that's the plan. That's the plan.
That's really cool. Well, I wish you every success with that. I think it sounds really excellent. Robin, what are your next steps over the next sort of few weeks? Where are you going with your research?
Well, I think we have the next iteration of this work is we kind of resisted the temptation, which was quite a significant temptation, to kind of dive into research work again, because this is part of a 4-year European Commission funded project. And we're basically a bit more than halfway through it now. We've got done 2.5 years, and we have to plan on like a year by year basis. So we have to think, what are we going to do with year 3 after having done this research? And as I said, like we've resisted, like there are so many things that you could go and explore more, but actually what we really feel like is that it's really important to try and find ways of getting this work out there and making it be useful for people. So that's really like the focus of our next year's work, and I'm definitely like super open to any suggestions on that front. I think the lady's gone now, but the person that asked me, sort of questions about her experiences like working with young people, I think the big and the small, like the aim of this work is to hopefully find ways to be useful to people who are sitting in rooms with young people, young adults in different ways, and having these conversations and to be helpful and to help people find more kind of positive and well-structured and stimulating language that can help people move to the next stage. And that's not always easy to do. So like we're probably going to create like a messaging guide on the back of this work and do, events like this where we kind of speak and talk about it to help people get that. And we're really interested, I guess, in also hearing from people. In fact, I should post the link to the research so that people can have a look in sort of people talking to us about what they find useful about it, what they want to be doing with it, because I think there's an awful lot to dig into here, and an awfully big task facing us in engaging and talking to the younger generation about this huge challenge. So. Yeah.
I felt very nostalgic seeing the 12 yellow stars against the blue as well. I mean, it's a phenomenal piece of research though, and it's fantastic to see how that's all going to sort of be disseminated and fed back. And Katy, I'm just sort of thinking as well with the research that you have. I mean, we'll chat with Victoria. It'd be wonderful to share that out amongst. If you're happy to share it out with lots of other different institutions as well. Few that come to mind already would be very interested. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, we'll be running it again next year, and we're hoping to have more organisations involved and perhaps broaden the type of organisations. So we're interested if museums want to be part of it as well, so we could extend it out to them. And we're also going to be doing a pilot project trying to influence audience travel choices. So we're hoping to do that in the southeast to get a handful of venues to see if the messaging, if we can try out different messaging, but also integrating things into booking systems so that we can actually then try and influence people's travel choices and see to what extent that can be changed. And if that works, we'll be creating a toolkit that comes out of that for venues to use and adopt. So because obviously travel to venues by audiences is, I think, the biggest part of the carbon footprint. So we're going to try and do something to tackle that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Victoria.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, actually, Katy, a couple of things I found. The fact that venues aren't doing the basics, which is saying what they're doing. And that was one thing, and how we encourage that. And the other thing is, having listened to Hannah and Robin, would you think about expanding the questions around content?
Yeah, definitely. We, as I say, we started very much with a blank sheet of paper and wanted just sort of basic answers to get as a baseline, but we're really interested in digging in further with our research, we're always really interested in trying to find things that then we can say to venues, this isn't big and scary, here's some things you can do with it. When we don't, and I know there's a place for much sort of wider research, but ours is always rooted in, okay, so what are the 3 things we can tell organisations to do with this so that they feel empowered and there isn't that guilt and just the enormity of it all is quite overwhelming. So yes, absolutely open to having questions in there that we can ask audiences, especially if it means that venues can then change something that they're doing and make a difference.
Yeah, and maybe sort of unpacking what you mean by climate crisis, what's involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really interesting research. Thank you. This has been really interesting, and I'd be very keen to sort of disseminate out this, and we'll put it up on our, if that's all right with everybody, on our YouTube, and send out links and information in a newsletter and upload it all onto our website. So if you can, I'll let you know when that's done, and feel free and please do disseminate it around through your digital media channels.
You had your,
Yeah, can I just say, what was really interesting, Katie, I know that you said a lot of it was venues. It would be so interesting to understand in terms of museums, because while kind of we are very much trying to deal with all of the kind of carbon footprint and the kind of more operational kind of stuff, what my boss likes to call bins and bulbs, we see our greatest strength and influence in how we kind of connect with our audiences and communities, and it felt like what your sort of research was saying was that wasn't necessarily where people assumed things should be happening. The kind of the programming around kind of climate change themes or whatever was quite low on the kind of priorities, and I don't know whether that is about assumptions about what that looks like in practice, because I know times have moved on considerably. Even in the last few years, we would not even consider putting an exhibition on telling people this is what you need to do, guilt finger pointing. We would do something much more subtle. And whether that might be about kind of an assumption for the people answering those questions, that kind of content being about the climate crisis is going to be horrific, doom, gloom, alarming, terrifying, not what I want to see, because it won't be enjoyable or stimulating. So it would be really interesting to understand if museums, there is a different expectation, or whether we're making assumptions that we're not maybe communicating with our audiences, or
I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, obviously our sample was pretty much a theatre audience. And so I think there was an element of, what would that look like then? And how would a play about climate change work? And so I think there's a lot, but even then there were a considerable number of people who were up for it. But I agree, I think museums have got a much bigger opportunity to do something around that because of the way that information is and collections are presented. So I would really like to do something with museums, because I think that could be a more rich theme. And I think you're right. I think it's dangerous to base anything on assumptions. But my sense of what I've seen so far is audiences and visitors are asking us to be bolder than even we think we should be. So I would hope that if we did do that with museums, we'd get a really positive response to that, especially if we've got examples to show them of things to go, this is what we mean, this kind of stuff. So it's a little bit abstract at the moment, I think, for people, but even then they're still up for it. So that's interesting.
Yes. I know it's also, I mean, sort of in just picking up about content and theatre, it's, that humour and comedy is a great way to assimilate very troubling stuff. And if you can get that balance right, that pathos, then actually it can be fantastic too. But hey, let's not start to write the play just yet.
I mean, the other thing I would say is theatres in particular, I don't know as much about museums and galleries, but theatres in particular have a problem with ageing audiences. They have a problem attracting young people. So purely from a marketing and audience development point of view, if this content and subject matter is really of interest to a younger audience, and we saw that younger audiences were more likely to give money to support it and to support these sort of initiatives, then we've got an opportunity to engage a whole new generation of people who haven't really been in the centre of theatre. It's been the older people that are retired, who were sort of the activists in the 60s, weren't they? Let's face it, they were the social activists then. So maybe there's this new wave of young people coming through that we can tap into and take them with us on this journey and make them into the people who, you know, the next generation after me will be going, oh, it's all those climate ones that are now our sort of members and friends, and they're the ones who give the money, in the way that we refer to the baby boomers now in theatre. So
no, I think that's really a very good parting presentation thinking. And so if there are any other questions, now is your chance. No little hands going up, in which case I'm going to say a very, very warm thank you to Katy and to Robin and to Hannah for your time, your expertise and your passion. And Bridget, and for everybody who's been here this evening, thank you so much, and wish you well. Stay warm as you can, and we'll be in touch with the next offer, which will be January 2023.